Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for another panel discussion. We had an awesome discussion yesterday, almost, I guess, less than 20 hours ago, about blockchain for good. It was really well received. We had a lot of comments, and many people joined the conversations. Um, I am not a blockchain expert. I would rather just keep myself to my own data science and geeky stuff that I do. So this is the panel that I'm also very excited about. This is AI for good. As we all know, AI can be used for businesses, for industries to help to drive some values for the business. We are going to talk about how can we use AI for some social good projects and initiatives. I am joined by awesome panelists, experts, industry and public sector experts. And within a couple of minutes, I'm going to introduce our panelists. But before that, make sure if you haven't joined the World Innovation Day hackathon, please go to the website worldinnovationday.com. Still, you have time to join a team and make some contribution and impact to the projects that are listed there. We started this initiative about a week ago, opened up by lined up keynote speakers from different part of the world. And now we are getting closer to the actual event. I would love to hear about you if you have joined. If you have any comments related to the hackathon, please put it in the chat. Otherwise, we would like to also know where are you tuning in from. Like always, we have a audience from all over the world, and we are so proud to see people joining us from different cities and countries. This is also a good chance for you to do some networking. So if you're working on some AI for good projects, that's the place to talk about. We might even take it on and respond to any questions during the chat. So here we go. Who we have here online? So we have Sadia from Pakistan. Hi, Carrie. Hello, Ismail. And many people joining us. Hi, Miguel. Please put the questions and comments in the chat. I'm going to now introduce our panelists. Here we go. Thank you very much for joining us. We have Brenda Banning, Vice President, Architecture and Industry Strategy, Japan and APAC at Oracle. Dr. Ian Oppermann, Chief Data Scientist, New South Wales Government, and Professor Matt Kuperholz, Chief Data Scientist, PwC. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us, Dave.
Awesome. All right, so I would like to start just to get a chance here to know about your experiences with AI for good. Please share some of your own projects or some of the use cases that you have witnessed about leveraging AI for social good. Would you like to
any
start?
order, Steve?
we can go as long as you like.
Excellent. So I think I'll start from some of the things that we're seeing. I would say a lot of it goes around medical research, and part of it is the AI side, and I think the big thing is also encouraging collaboration. So what you're starting to see is as AI has moved into the cloud capabilities, and that is you're now being able to have people from different parts of the world collaborating, understanding the models that are being used. So for us, there's things around, for instance, the Children's Medical Research Institute, who's looking at genetic diseases in children, and really being able to shift the amount of time that it's taking to do that research. We're models and simulations used to run for 30 days. They're now running in a week. Still seems like a very long time, but that's a massive shift down. And as I said, the other big thing is now being able to have collaboration from different locations to be able to share models, simplify models, and really bring research together. So
Awesome. Thanks, Brenda.
I'm happy to give a couple of examples of some of the better uses of AI, I think, Steve. Steve, thanks for your content on LinkedIn. It's some of my favorite content to browse through. I think you curate beautifully. You know, I think one of the challenges with talking about AI for good is definitions. So let's step aside defining AI at the moment, but also defining good. You know, good for shareholders is not necessarily good for customers, is not necessarily good for employees, is not necessarily good for citizens. And my idea of good as an Australian citizen might be very different to a Chinese citizen's version of good. So we've got these so we've got a challenge with definitions. But I'm going to stick to the centre of that minefield and talk about things that are probably unequivocally seen as good. One of the areas we've been applying AI very successfully for close to 2 decades now is in the area of workplace safety. So with a view to everyone is entitled to come home safe from work, and also recognising that in dangerous and heavy industries, an accident, a fatal accident or a serious accident is also very, very bad for business in terms of shutdowns and your insurance premiums and the costs, etc. So we want to bring everyone home safe from work. What we traditionally do in a safety sphere as an ex-actuary, I can comment, is we look at the claims and the incidents. But when we actually look at these workplaces, there are so many latent data assets, whether it's the machinery itself, which is now very often enabled with many, many sensors, whether it's fatigue and other sort of personal wearables, whether it's the rostering, these social networks we can engineer from the connectivity, the training records, the hiring records. There is a wealth of data assets in operational systems that AI is fantastic for bringing together and finding those patterns as to what the early warning indicators look like of a dangerous workplace. We've found everything from people that shouldn't be allowed to drive trucks given their underlying, driving behaviour from the GPS and the telematics, right through to certain networks that shouldn't be rostered on together because of the prevailing viewpoints. There's too much groupthink, there's not enough diversity, right through to issues with fatigue and training and hiring the right people in the first place. So safety has been applied, as I said, for decades in all manner of industries. I think that's a great example of AI for good. A more recent one that we've had a bunch of great success with AI is maximising distributed energy resources in the renewable space through the effective forecasting of energy prices and demand, and optimization using AI of configurable portfolios to basically run enormous virtual power plants where at the end of the day everyone gets better, cheaper, greener power at the same time as preserving the life of the generation and distribution assets. So 2 unequivocal arguments in favour of AI.
That's awesome. Thanks, Matt. And I would just want to mention here that I can say from AI for good perspective, you're kind of looking at global goals that UN put forward as 17 global goals. We can argue that people might have different understanding of those global goals. And if UN is representing real, representative of the whole world, but I would just keep it simple. Let's just keep it to, the global understanding of what good means. I think this is the discussion that we have also for ethics in the world. It's what ethics means and whose ethics. But still, I definitely believe that we might be able to pull together something very, something that we can all agree about. Thank you very much, Matt. Ian, would you like to add?
Thanks, Steve. So New South Wales government has been on quite a journey around use of AI for quite a few years now. And we recently released our AI assurance framework. And during the process of developing the assurance framework, we looked around at all the different use cases of AI across government, and there were many. Two of my favorite, though, which speak to good, are the system that's used to identify vulnerable individuals by Revenue New South Wales. Revenue New South Wales does a range of things, but they generate revenue for the state. But they also administer fines, they do garnishing, they do a whole lot of other activities. One of the things that they realized is that if you keep finding people who are in vulnerable circumstances, you can actually drive them into a much worse state, much worse outcome than not finding them. So what the folks there did in Revenue New South Wales was to build a prediction tool, as to say, identify whether or not this person is likely to be vulnerable. And if they are vulnerable, then don't keep finding them, change your behavior. So it's, to some extent, it's the government equivalent of a next best action. And so instead of finding people, they're put through a different sort of program for non-financial response to those fines. There's another aspect, which is the emergency department and the sepsis prediction. Sepsis is something that can happen to you while you're in an emergency department. It's definitely life-threatening and has very, very adverse outcomes, even if it doesn't kill you. So the historical approach is a nurse would move around the emergency department, write details down on a glove, go back to the desk, punch the details into a spreadsheet, and it might come up with an alert to say this person's likely to have sepsis. Now what's happening is, at least in some hospitals in New South Wales, is the constant monitoring of different data streams and the alerting associated with the combination of different factors, and saying this person is likely to have sepsis, take a very different course of action. So again, it's a little bit like a next best action. But the outcomes in all of these cases are very, very different from the sort of outcomes that if you're a bank, or if you're an insurance organization, or someone looking to deliver a result to people. They really are about preventing very substantial adverse outcomes and ensuring that action which is taken is much more appropriate for the individual needs of that person in their circumstances at that time.
Thanks, Ian. That's awesome. I know that you're doing great projects with the team at New South Wales Government. I guess the next question I would like to start with you. It's about data and data sharing. We all know that in many cases, data is really important to have. And thanks very much for the background, Matt. I think now it's more clear what we are going to refer to. So in many cases, data is needed for building an AI platform. I know that theoretically, my friends at academia might say we do have an AI without data as well, but let's just keep it non-academic to this way. And so there are lots of data in different places. Data sets are kind of siloed. What are the, I guess, new models that will enable us to unlock these data?
Yeah, so data sharing is the absolute basis of being able to do useful things with that data. But it's such a vexed topic. I personally spent the last 7 years, and I feel every day of those 7 years, trying to address the issues of developing repeatable patterns for data sharing and usage. And there are a whole lot of reasons why people don't share data. There's the unwilling, unable, not allowed arguments. And at least in New South Wales, the unwilling has changed a lot. There's a great deal of willingness. There's also the not allowed has also changed a lot. But it's the unable part, the what are the repeatable patterns of sharing. And over the last couple of years, we've been working on trying to do exactly that. Understand what sort of data you've got. Is it personal? Is it personal and sensitive? Is it personal and not sensitive? Is it neither personal nor sensitive? Understand the chain of provenance, the chain of custody, the chain of authorizing frameworks to the point where it gets to you. Do the exercise of working out whether it's fit for the purpose that you're about to use it for, and then use it, whether it's for AI or whether it's for even really simple things like benchmarking or generating a different data product, and then provide the guidance on how to use that data product or how to use that data set, or restrictions on use or prohibitions on use, or any sort of next step that you can actually help that next person do the right thing with the data set. Those simple data lifecycle, before you use it, fitness for purpose, after you use it, steps are starting to actually help people feel empowered enough that they can control or guide or manage what happens next, but also understand whether or not it's fit for purpose. And we're in the process at the moment of trying to bring those simple models to life for those different data sets and create exactly the things you need to know before you use it, the things you need to know when you use it, and the things you need to tell the next person about how to use it appropriately.
Thanks, Ian. Matt, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I think it's actually a very exciting time in terms of some new and not so new, but the prevalence of privacy enhancing technologies. So different ways of actually using data and allowing data to often, I don't want to conflate too many topics, but in terms of data fabrics where data might reside not all in one central place, and we've got arrangements for the anonymized sharing of it through all kinds of interesting emerging techniques ranging from homomorphic encryption and zero-based proofs and adding adequate noise or salt to the data so that it's not individual data anymore, but it's still usable. Of course, we could always anonymize or obfuscate or aggregate the data to get around some of these concerns as well. So there's this whole new area of having faith in the technologies. But I think actually sometimes it's much simpler. Why do people do anything? We do things because our biological neural network is goal seeking towards some desirable incentive. You see, we're not that much different from the machines. If you provide the correct incentives and manage the disincentives to share data, then I think you get this sort of greater good, because the more data, the better for many of these purposes. So I'm going to talk a bit today around an initiative I'm very close to and have been championing for a long time around traceability and the desire to try and get supply chain data shared out of the silos where it resides. Now, if we can prove, pretty easily done, that there is value from combining and working with this data, whether that's food security, whether it's capturing premium prices in overseas markets, whether it's defending markets or making sort of product recalls and things easier. Nevertheless, when you prove that there is value there as an incentive, that you have a structure in place for sharing that value back to the contributors of the data, and that you manage the disincentives in terms of they always remain owners of the data and in control of how it's used, which doesn't mean it won't be used for other purposes. It's just there'll be a permissioning system. You then actually solve the problem, because I'm actually incentivized to share my data and to get value shared back from it. And the disincentives are minimized in terms of I feel that I retain control of that data. So I think you can take it right down to providing the correct incentives and warranties, and I think government has a strong role to play there, Ian, which can unlock those data from the silos because people want to share their data.
Yeah, that's a great point. But on the other hand, a lot of different organizations and even in public sector, they sometimes don't feel very incentivized to open it in a way that is digestible and easy to use. That is also another, I guess, point we have seen. Like I can give you an example of LinkedIn. I asked LinkedIn to give myself the data that I provided for the last 2 years. They actually gave it away, and that's they dumped a couple of gigabytes of data in a platform that it's not readable and you cannot use it. It probably takes the whole team to digest and understand it for 2 years. So that's also another, I guess, point that we are seeing about the way that these are delivered, and it's sometimes a little bit of a token effort.
And Steve, just to follow up that up, sorry, Brenda, I just want to close with this idea of there are people in organisations whose business model is the antithesis of data sharing. It's the data asymmetry that they trade off. And if you're not paying for a product, then it's quite likely you're paying for it with your data. Enough said around that.
Correct.
It's challenging those models to invent models that are actually about sharing slices of a much bigger pie that comes from the combined value of the data. That is a real phase change to what we're talking about. Over to you, Brenda.
Thank you.
No worries. I think some of it, I've spent the better part of my life working in public sector, and I also think some of it is to do with not really, looking at the breadth of where data can be used, right? So there's been a bit of a fear around leakage and the use of the data, how the data could be used. Even with different ways of doing anonymization, I think the idea that you had of the fabric, so that you can look at the data from in situ, that side of things. But I also think sometimes people look at their data and what they have and don't necessarily understand the types of use cases where their data sets could be part of enabling something for good, right? So I think in some ways, growing this community, understanding the community and where data is being used, how having different data sets and being able to combine them, maybe in a way that, because of the way it's been locked in your silo, you've never been able to do before. So I do think there's a level of restriction also, because people don't, back to the value, don't see the value that may be gained by sharing specific data sets, right? And when you dealing with government, when you get machinery of government changes, and that the way people look at those data sets as the portfolios change over time gets shifted, and so it just kind of gets held back in locked away. So things like this, being able to have people express and look at the way that they would use data, promoting more open sharing of data, I think will slowly shift that culture.
Thanks, Brenda. I would like to get some of the, I guess, practical examples, and would like to know the practical experiences that you had in building new models for data sharing across different sectors, government, public, private, and across geographics. And I would like to hear more about the stories and maybe the future trend.
So we can start with some that are on our plate at the moment are in the public domain as well, from this idea of sharing for traceability. So there are different benefits, whether you're a producer, and some of the obvious ones for producers in Australia, where we produce, we can only eat 30 to 40% of the food we produce at best. It's a premium brand. It's welcome in our nearest neighbours up in Asia. It's available at a premium. However, if we can digitally trace it for certain categories, we have proven that the premium available is in excess of 50% of the sticker price. For Australian beef that's digitally traceable as Australian beef in China, the cashed up middle class consumer will pay 50% above the rate. So there's immediate value available there, which goes the whole way back to the Meat and Livestock Association to encourage standards for sharing of data and for protecting the industry. Also at the border, we've got programs in place for things like Green Lane for import, where we say to providers, hey, you've got a ton of digital information about the materials you're bringing in bulk into Australia. If you're prepared to share that with us digitally, we can give you a faster green lane at the border, so you get your products faster and there's less overhead and less inefficiency, and we don't have to go and open those containers and audit them simply because you've shared data. Similarly, for congestion busting on export at the border, there are many programs where we're using data sharing as a way to expedite that, and sort of this everyone wins type scenario.
Awesome.
So I think, I sort of mentioned this in my opening, but I would say, as I look through a number of the use cases and that we've seen, I think that the data sharing, but also then how that's opened up and created an ecosystem around that data sharing and collaborating. So, before it seemed to be that people would take their different data sets, they'd work on it individually, maybe share within a small cohort of what their findings were, get peer reviewed, et cetera, in there, shift it. And there's been a significant shift, and part of this you saw with COVID-19 research and various things, is more and more of the world coming together to review what's being done to help, in refining the research and looking at things in different ways. And I think that's actually pretty cool. What we've seen in social media areas and that is sort of the echo chamber side of things, but we also have this whole power of bringing people together to bounce ideas off of each other and learn from each other. And that, I think, is something that's quite fascinating with this. Victoria University did a research on from a social media and how on domestic violence and being able to bring that together. And again, they were able to have much more collaboration across the researchers, and that improves the output that you're getting.
If I could, Steve, add a different layer to that, or a further layer to that. There's often a challenge between the people who want access to the data and the people who pay the price of actually delivering it and cleaning it and managing it. I mean, the data custodians, they've collected the data for a particular reason, they're using it for that particular reason, and if you want to use it for a secondary reason, there's that issue of fitness for purpose about authorizing framework and so on, but there's also the effort and burden goes onto someone who doesn't really benefit from it. One of the biggest projects that I've ever worked on in New South Wales government was building a data set for children identified at risk of significant harm. We called it the out-of-home care data set historically, now it's the human services data asset, and we had several attempts to create this data asset, longitudinal journeys of children who've been identified at risk of harm in vulnerable situations. The potential social good from that is enormous, and we've, as I said, created the data set twice, a smaller one over 10 years, a larger one over 30 years, smaller one with 44,000 children, a larger one containing a much, much bigger portion of the population, and more expansive in terms of the different parts of government that we see those journeys through. The benefit of that data set, the analysis of that data set is extraordinary, but the challenges of building it include a whole lot of issues associated with the time, effort, and expense of many parts of government coming together to link this data asset. The lack of conviction that it really will deliver real world outcomes. Understanding is one thing, identifying points of friction is another thing, but making a difference to children's lives and their families is a completely different issue, because you need to touch the real world. And finally, the fact that the request was made to so many different data custodians, all of whom are busy, all of whom have many other data requests, in anticipation of building this one massive data set. It is really something that is challenging to place that value proposition in a context of people who actually need to do the work and who won't necessarily benefit. And in some cases will be shown to have issues of data quality, will be shown to have issues of that their department isn't necessarily delivering the best possible service. So there's this whole series of sensitivities and sensibilities and real issues associated with delivery of that data. So the value proposition, who pays versus who benefits, is really something to think about, as well as those sensitivities.
Thanks, Ian. I guess it challenges a lot of the organizations that are doing the social good are either non-for-profit and sort of a public sector. I mean, I know that all the other privates are also doing their own job, but I'm just thinking about the ones that are actually not having access to these data, and they don't have necessarily the means to be able to curate these data. So they would have a lot of challenges to incentivize government and the private sector. So this is probably something that we need to think about. How can we, as a public, how can we think about incentivizing those custodians of data to be able to share it with the ones that would like to deliver some sort of social good initiatives? Do you think any ways that are kind of possible to overcome these challenges?
Synthetic data has got to be one viable approach, Steve. It depends on the use case. But creating synthetic data sets, which isn't anyone's real data, but by the parameters in which are based on real data, is a neat way to sidestep and allow people to work meaningfully with data. A lot of the sort of self-driving cars and other computer vision initiatives are now finding that it makes sense to train on synthetically generated data. And also, you know, we keep talking about data. I think there is many growing fields of AI that can make more use of less data, or reinforcement learning, or generative adversarial networks and the like, which themselves can produce some pretty valuable insights without actually having to have these massive data assets underneath them, with all the privacy and cleaning and explanation and quality issues which Ian's pointed to.
Yeah, just to maybe riff off Matt there. I think synthetic data sets are really quite powerful, and there's once upon a time we might generate something which statistically was similar or adhered to, you know, we've generated data sets in New South Wales for training purposes, adhering to a whole lot of different formulaic approaches. But the ability to add different amounts of salt, I think that was the expression Matt used, I quite like it, different amounts of noise to your data to produce a data set which is almost exactly the same, but might be protected from a linkability perspective. Something which is slightly less the same is useful for sort of generic building of algorithms, and something which is much less the same and still useful for other purposes, I think is where we're starting to go. So it's the ability to create different data products from a raw data set which are fit for the purpose you're planning to use it for, without revealing the underlying data itself, or only giving a sense of the underlying data itself. I think are some really, really powerful ways of doing things. Matt also talked about homomorphic encryption, and that's got great promise for being able to do amazing things without actually touching the data in its raw form. And that, I think, still has a little way to go in terms of the speed of compute and what you can do with it. But it's so promising that it really starts to remove or change the nature of the question around things like privacy. We're not, by letter of law, now touching the raw data itself, but we're able to access the data in some way, shape, or form, generate an insight, an action, or in fact an alarm, an alert, an action, or a decision from that data. Do we still have the same concept of privacy? Do we still have the same concept of appropriate use of data? Because technically, I think we can start to really change the nature of how we access from the traditional approach. And so the questions and conversations about appropriateness and around do we still mean the same things about privacy start to change because of these technical capabilities.
Yeah, very interesting. I think, you know, what we always also have the issue with, or you hear around, is where the data sets are coming from, right? So what's the bias in them? How, you know, as we're bringing and our synthetic data side, so I'm just going to put a little bit of a different spin on it. In the way that we're doing that, how are we introducing more bias? Or what biases are we? We're always introducing bias. So what biases are being introduced? How do those come together? And you know, it's I think it's more about being aware of the data that's there, and the way that it is being used and interpreted, and being open to what results you may get. Because sometimes when people look at results, again, because of their mental model, end up going down a path that if they take a step back and really look at the results they're getting, they may go in a different direction. So it's, to me, there's the whole the data sets and that we have. Even in populating those, we're going to have bias in those. And you know, so part of this as well in that data sharing is helping from a platform perspective, and again, sharing research data. So you know, there's various open data initiatives going on for research groups to be able to, and I think this comes back to your incentives to get the value, right? To be able to share data sets, be able to have curated data sets from organizations, you know, especially around mapping and NASA and climate and what you're seeing globally, and how you can bring all those together. So it's a big challenge that I think we haven't really wrapped our heads around, where we're collecting the data from necessarily, and how that skews the responses we're getting sometimes when we're looking at our models.
Yes, we should start talking about bias and doing AI responsibly before too long.
Try to keep it away from that discussion, because we had another 1 hour discussion about that, if you remember that, Matt. But yeah, that is a core part of any sort of usage of AI.
This is a map of hundreds of different types of cognitive bias before we even start to think about AI bias. And yes, our data is most likely biased. It's not a true representation of the underlying population, or our techniques introduce many different types of bias. Some of them are desirable bias, and some of them are not. I think where we are headed in terms of AI for good is agreeing these definitions and using available open source methods, shared methods, to measure and quantify and track and monitor that bias, so that we all agree on the performance of the AI and we can adhere to that. The performance is, a very important middle tier. Underpinning it all, however, and I think the technology helps this as well. I missed your blockchain one. I'm sad about that, because I'm a big fan of distributed ledger technology and what it can do in terms of helping with data governance. If you wanted to conceive of an environment where I could actually own my data and release it for reward, then sort of a smart contract distributed ledger environment talks to that. If you're talking about great data governance with a permanent indelible record as to how and where that data was used, that's very hard to circumvent. Again, a distributed ledger environment talks to that. If you're talking about linking physical and digital goods for tracing a cow, or for tracing a batch or a lot, then again, a distributed ledger environment helps with that. Not in isolation, very much in tandem with AI and leading tagging technologies and all kinds of exponential technology. But I think it's a big part of the solution is to give me comfort that I can trust. And I think technologies of trust, whether it's your homomorphic encryption or differential privacy or distributed ledgers, but most likely all of them orchestrated beautifully together, is how we make this as good as it can be.
So the good thing is we didn't miss the blockchain session. We've just had some of it there, so that's really good. I wanted to talk about bias ever so briefly, and I think that diagram that Matt's got behind him is just wonderful, because that talks about human bias. And one of the interesting side effects associated with the scrutiny that we're putting to AI projects is when we're looking to use AI and data for a particular project, and we have some discomfort about that project, we've got a very simple approach. We say, well, we'll take the AI out of the project, and do we still have a problem with it? Okay, well, then we'll take the data out of the project, and do we still have a problem with it? It's actually what we're doing, rather than the use of data or the use of AI. Data and AI allow us to do things faster, to scale, and to increase the impact. But if we have discomfort about what we're doing, then that's a much more fundamental issue. And the side benefit of that is, of course, with data and AI, we can do what we currently do more efficiently, more effectively. But rather than just doing an old thing in a new way, if that old thing actually wasn't the best we could possibly do, we can actually start to think about doing things differently. The ability to use data to understand the world differently, to understand a problem differently, the ability of AI to spot things or to predict things or to explore things or to do some simulations or what-if scenarios, means that we can actually be a little more ambitious about what we're trying to do and try to deliver on a broader real-world outcome. So some side benefits of all of this is that we're actually starting to apply scrutiny to what we have always done, paradoxically, because we're going to use data and because we're going to use AI and the scrutiny that attracts. So I think that's quite a nice thing. And that includes those issues of human bias. We start to spot them because we're looking at the machine or the data.
Thanks, Ian. And yeah, it was a great discussion about blockchain. I can see that it could be a complementary, but unfortunately, we had, I guess, a limited number for the panel. Would love to have a bigger panels in future, of a merge of data professionals and blockchain professionals, I try to be a little bit of sort of a representative of the data science, I guess, industry in there. But now we know that, like, all right, like we have a lot of different ways of capturing the data and lots of different practices. We have talked about the blockchain as a way to, I guess, keep the data, or about the reinforcement learning to generate the data. So how can we build a repository to keep all the good practices and models and experiences to help us to use the data for good?
Well, let me jump in. So one of the things that I really like to do is reframe the conversation in terms of the outcome we're looking to deliver on. It has a couple of really good advantages. One is that it tends to depoliticize, because you can argue about the outcome backwards and forwards. Is this the outcome we want? But the moment you talk about the outcome, you take away some of those challenges of, could we really do it? These are all the reasons we couldn't do it. There's all these technical problems around doing it. This is what we really want. And the UN Sustainable Development Goals are a great set of outcomes, with then have the next step, which is those indicators. And then typically what we like to do is build data sets which help us understand the journey of child, family, household, community, a village well, a piece of infrastructure, a business, and see whether or not we can identify those points of friction where we move towards or away from the outcomes we want, where we can apply behavioural nudges or do policy differently or service delivery differently. But all of that really is pinned on those outcomes and a credible pathway of building the case for change to deliver on those outcomes. The outcomes we want, by definition, we've not achieved. So almost by definition, we don't know how to do it. So there needs to be some experimentation. And along the way, if we are constantly building the case for change, start small, fewest partners, fewest resources, fewest data sets, we can build the case for change that says, we believe these areas are working well, let's emphasize those. We suspect these areas are not working, let's de-emphasize those. And there's a whole world in the middle where we need to be able to explore. So help us find data sets that help us explore, help us find partners who help us explore and do things differently, and again, build that case for change. But the most important part is keeping those outcomes in front of us and credibly building towards them, building that case of change, that theory of change towards those outcomes, typically in a couple of horizons.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Yeah. I think, and that really does come back together to complex problem solving, right? And the whole idea of keeping your North Star, understanding the outcome is the North Star, and how to make steps towards it. And I think I really like, Ian, the view around the experimentation. When it's a complex problem, we don't know the answers. And I think that's the thing that we really need to come to grips with. Is to be able to have that experimentation, understand what we're getting out of that, review, did that take us a step closer to the outcome, and then how do we take our next step, and getting people together to do that experimentation. If it was a simple answer, we hopefully would have got there by now.
That's right. Still, this is the platform to, I guess, ideate, and maybe some of these ideas will get forward and become some of them become a reality.
And with that in mind, Steve, we do have to take this back into possibly our primary education system, but at the very least our secondary and tertiary education systems that need to, the question starts to become not, can we do this? With these exponential technologies driven by AI as our crowning achievement as a species, in my opinion anyway, it's not, can we do this? It's, should we do this? So we've got to start giving people accepted academic frameworks for helping them make that decision. Should I do this? I'm in a position of power in a private industry. Should I do it? Where's the framework? What do I reach to? I actually understand about data and AI ethics. I understand how to start solving these problems. So we've got to bring it into our formal education systems earlier and more fulsomely.
No, that's totally agree with that as well. I guess I would like to take it to pretty much our final question, just conscious of the time. What is if you want to mention one data set, what is the one data set that you think people should be aware of, that you're working on, or you think will be very helpful for AI to for good?
I mean, right now in the world where we're at, and I sort of alluded to it at the beginning, for our organization, it really does come back to working with Oxford University, particularly in looking at variant intelligence for COVID-19, right, and early recognition of new variants, which keeps us healthy, which I'm going to put in the good category. So,
great.
In my case, it's the human services data asset, which is the multi-year evolution of that vulnerable community data set with longitudinal journeys of hundreds of thousands of people across all aspects of government. It's the largest of its kind that's ever been built in Australia, at least, and it's something which is potentially an amazing way of understanding how the system actually works and what the experience is for people in the system. And that's also given us confidence to start building data sets around reform of other large complex systems, such as in Australia, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, where we're building data sets now across state and Commonwealth boundaries. And New South Wales builds one, South Australia builds one, Victoria builds one, and potentially they can all join up. And so we're working our way through those really big data projects now with much more confidence, not only around how to do it, but also the governance that we need to put in place and the frameworks we need to put in place so people can access, can analyze, and can deliver results out.
I think the beautiful thing about this discussion is it doesn't matter if it's the data set that either of you have talked about or that I'm going to talk about. The common thread is, how do we sort out the governance? How do we agree on the right level of trust and faith that the owners of the data can contribute? For mine, I'm going to go with traceability. I've posted a link in the chat. Traceability and sharing supply chain data really only leads to good. Driven massively, the digitization of supply chains has been accelerated through global supply chain issues sort of brought to a head with COVID. But if you think particularly about the wealth of this nation, and what we have in abundance and what's desirable by our neighbours and our trading partners, all of that is enhanced by sharing traceability data. And this is data that already exists in most supply chains. It just exists in silos. The logistics companies have it. The government departments have it. The raw producers have it. By encouraging that to be shared and capturing that premium for trusted brand Australia internationally, and I'm not just talking about food or resources. This comes down to the traceability of green electrons and of renewable energy that I think we'll end up exporting due to how fortunate we are with the amount of sun and wind we get. So to enhance and bring together traceability data sets to allow AI to work its magic and find that free lunch, that mythical sort of efficiency and optimization that comes by combining data and paying high-end AI to it, is one of the most exciting areas I'm playing in.
Awesome. Last night we had Lian Kemp from Everledger talking about all the traceability and how blockchain is helping with that. I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the discussion that we had last night. So thank you very much. Any other closing notes from the panelists? All right. Okay, we are kind of at the end of our panel discussion. Thank you very much, our amazing audience, putting some interesting, I guess, notes in the comments, and I could see that Matt was kind of also answering and responding to some of them. So thank you very much, Matt, as well for that. Looking forward to having all of you in the hackathon tomorrow, and please follow our future panel discussions. There will be definitely some more interesting coming up. Thanks, Ian, Brenda, and Matt.
Thanks all.